The illusion that Yuji is just an unfortunate bystander was shattered for us when it was revealed that Kenjaku had been controlling everything all along, that he even got Yuji to ingest the first finger. But what if Yuji isn't the vessel we think he is? What if Yuji was a cage made specifically for Sukuna by Kenjaku? And what if this was the key to Yuji's survival? Hey, my name is Esper, and today I will talk about how Yuji is not who we thought he was to a depth nobody asked for, and how this may make or break his ability to further survive in the story. But to understand why this is, you have to go back with me to chapter 160, objectively the best chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen, to this exact panel. So why is this important? To understand the importance of this panel, we have to understand Sukuna. What does Sukuna want the most? It's an incredibly easy question to answer, at least on a surface level. In fact, he answered it for us in episode 1. He just wants to reincarnate, which is done, fight, and kill shit. If it goes beyond that, then we don't yet know. Here's the thing though. If you're Kenjaku, this is a certifiably bad thing, which you might be like, nah, Esper, they want the same thing. Look at all the havoc and destruction that Kenjaku has done. The Heian period is where Sukuna flourished. That's what Kenjaku wants. Well, yes and no. To achieve his end goal, he first needs to do a controlled demolition. Kenjaku is demolishing the current Jujutsu infrastructure to make room for his creation, as they cannot coexist. So why does this all matter? Because this is something that has been staring at us this whole time, something that was delivered to us and set up with the expectation of it being special, and that this was out of the norm. But this whole idea of Yuji being special is a red herring. Not because he's not special, but it's because he's special not for the reasons we think. And it was honestly a masterful subversion from Gege, and I cannot believe I didn't realize it sooner. The beginning of chapter 160 is many things. It's some of Jujutsu Kaisen's best writing to date. It's a chapter that masterfully instills a slow, subtle horror. But more importantly, it is the Rosetta Stone of understanding the rest of Jujutsu Kaisen, because it is the first time we see Kenjaku essentially by himself without threat of being observed by anyone else. We can then use this to decode every interaction that Kenjaku has ever had. Don't be fooled by the sales pitch of JJK. It is not a story about an unfortunate boy who gets swept away into this madness. Jujutsu Kaisen is the story of Kenjaku executing his millennia-long plan. Yuji can still die. This chapter is the key to unlocking and understanding the mysteries behind Yuji's entire purpose and how he may be able to use that to survive. But first, we need to do our deep dive on why Kenjaku made Yuji into a cage. Let's go back to chapter 160 and you'll slowly understand why. This chapter is called The Colony. Kenjaku appears to Sasaki in a dream, waking her up Inception style, and unfortunately, Joseph Gordon-Levitt does not appear. See Kenjaku start off with an apology while Sasaki asks who he is. Kenjaku explains that he is the sorcerer who placed a barrier there and that this place would soon be a battleground. So far, this is relatively the same as the Kenjaku that's being presented to us in the rest of the manga, but he changes as the rest of the chapter unravels. The rest of the panels feel eerie and unsettling. So let's walk through them. The way that Kenjaku gripped Sasaki's hand like a parent would a child is so uncharacteristically tender of him. And if we look at Sasaki's other hand, it was initially balled up into a tight fist as they passed through the darkness with Kenjaku as her only shepherd. But slowly, she began to relax, maybe even take comfort in his presence. It's incredibly interesting that these panels suggest the dream space as a physical realm. Sasaki and Kenjaku starting off on the left side of the page and then being on the right side in the next panel implies movement. It implies that they walked out of the dream space into the physical, waking world, where we see the contrast of the horrors happening in the background of the second shot, juxtaposed to the darkness that they were previously in, which is a brilliant choice from Gege. Beyond that though, notice how Kenjaku's smile grew as they exited the dream space and the way Sasaki's hands relaxed. She must have taken at least some sort of comfort in his presence, especially because she truly does not know how malevolent he is. Keep in mind, even how Kenjaku is still dressed in Geta's monk attire. I can imagine she didn't process the entire speech that Kenjaku gave. So to Sasaki, Kenjaku is helping her when what he's really doing is just what he has to, but not really. What is required of him is safe passage. Kenjaku in these moments though could be mistaken for kind. Without context, he could be mistaken for a benevolent figure if we didn't already have him characterized as the reason for all of the suffering that has happened so far. This is a stark difference to the Kenjaku we know. And that fucked me up. It felt really strange to me that the person who locked up Gojo, the person who stole the body of Geta, the one who made Yuji and placed him in the way of all of this suffering, and the one who has already made thousands suffer, was being portrayed in this light. It was a disturbing feeling because it was uncanny. It made me uncomfortable. Something wasn't right. The discomfort of this chapter builds up slowly. The implication of the space between waking and dreaming being a curse becomes a further mystery as they move within it. Are these people who move through the space now cursed? All of these small horrors crescendo to the point where he says, "Thank you for getting along with my son." I absolutely lost it at that. How does Kenjaku have the right to even call Yuji his son? How does he have the right to do that after he made him suffer lifetimes of pain and agony at 15? And why did it seem so fucking sincere? This whole scene built up to this moment, and it was also carefully placed in the space between the waking and dreaming of Sasaki, a curse. Sasaki is a random person who has no idea what sorcery is, what the culling games are. She is a side character. She doesn't understand a thing. This is why it feels so sincere when Kenjaku gave Sasaki his thanks. He wasn't trying to influence or play mind games. That's why I feel like Kenjaku in this moment could be freer with his words. There was no performance to put on. There was no subliminal messaging. There was no need to hide anything. This girl would not make a difference. But even with all of that, even with all of those little threads, it still didn't fucking make sense. Everyone has a defining trait. I can't reach the top shelf without a step stool, and I love being right about everything. And Kenjaku is a self-serving motherfucker down to his very bones. Kenjaku only ever cares about the things that bring him closer to his goal. He stops caring that some of the cursed spirits died after Gojo was imprisoned because he accomplished his goal. He stopped caring about the Death Womb blood paintings because they weren't living up to the potential he wanted. So if we follow that logic, the fact that he still cares about Yuji throughout this whole time is because he is serving a purpose for him. So what is that purpose? The obvious answer would be Kenjaku brought Sukuna back so he can participate in his plans and cause the awakening. But that's a single-digit IQ take. The 9,000 IQ take is to dissect all the ways in which Jujutsu Kaisen led us to believe that that's true, and all the subtle ways it actually was telling us Kenjaku's larger plan. So let's look at our clues. Sukuna is said to be able to pick his vessel, but Kenjaku specifically mentioned that he had those vessels in just curse objects, so he had a hand in guiding Sukuna. Yuji was specifically made by Kenjaku. Megumi saying that his ability to host is a 1 in a million chance and that it was poisonous misled us to believe that Kenjaku designed Yuji for the purpose of becoming a vessel, when it was the opposite. He was meant to keep Sukuna at bay until the time was right. How do you convince the single most powerful sorcerer to just sit around and wait when the world is ripe for killing? You don't. If it works for the strongest in this time, it can work for the strongest from the ancient times. Build a prison and toss him in it. Then he'll be ready and even more itching to fight. The roots of Kenjaku's plans dig deep into every crevice of Jujutsu Kaisen. Just look at the continuation of Fearsome Womb. This chapter, we see Yuji switching out with Sukuna to deal with the special grade curse under the impression that he can regain control. As Sukuna kills the special grade, we find out that it was holding a finger. Put this in your back pocket because it will be important later. And as we wait for Yuji to take back over, we find out that he just can't. Sukuna, now knowing that Yuji can't turn back, holds him hostage by pulling out his heart. And he gives Megumi a fairly light beatdown if you ask me, because Sukuna just seems to be having fun. Then Megumi, because he's always holding on to this insane ace up his sleeve with the intent to die, almost calls on Mahoraga. And Yuji wakes up. When I first read that, I actually thought, how lucky Yuji was able to take control. I was young and stupid back then. It's not that simple. I didn't know what kind of manga I was reading yet, and I'm sure neither did you. But we all found out very quickly. Sukuna, in that moment, set his eyes on Mahoraga and Megumi. He bided his time as more and more fingers were restored to him. This is now all pretty evident, but here's the thing. Sukuna here might have devised a plan, but he is still playing into Kenjaku's larger plan. Early on in this part of the story, Kenjaku pretty much had a monopoly on the fingers that weren't being kept by Jujutsu High, and he used those fingers to propel his plot forward. He was always playing both sides. Why was it that he was okay with the cursed spirits failing to make Sukuna make a deal with Yuji? Because he knew that if Yuji was alive, they had already made the deal, because the finger he planted facilitated a situation that Sukuna would need to come out. 3 first years going into a special grade fight is nothing but slaughter. That is fact, and we already know that he had plans in the Jujutsu higher-ups that would willingly deploy a 15-year-old boy to die, so it's not by any means a stretch. He also let Mahito believe that he needed to convince Sukuna, and in fact steered him toward these motions because it benefited one of his goals. His end goal was to harvest Jogo, Mahito, and even Hanami. With Gojo in play though, he was bound to lose at least one of them, so he keeps pushing them. He lets them loose in Jujutsu High to give them some combat practice. He lets them see Gojo in action to motivate them to get stronger. He lets Mahito toy with Yuji because it would never harm Yuji and Sukuna can defend himself. And the benefits of actually letting them play this game is much more than any potential downside, and we were told most of this when Kenjaku did the big unveiling of his plan. And with Kenjaku knowing full well that Sukuna can pick his vessel, he dangled Megumi Fushiguro in front of him with the delicious prospect of taming Mahoraga in a body that has the inherited techniques of the Zenin clan that can rival Satoru Gojo, in addition to the techniques Sukuna already possesses. Just know and keep reminding yourself that Jujutsu Kaisen thus far is the story of the execution of Kenjaku's plan. It is not the story of Yuji or even Gojo. It might not even be a tale where the heroes come out on top. We have been misled this entire time. Jujutsu Kaisen on the first episode sold us 2 things. Yuji is special because he didn't die from consuming Sukuna, and in fact revived him. He was even further more special because he was a cage instead of a vessel. This is the biggest misdirection in all of Jujutsu Kaisen. These are all false. At first we were led to believe that this is simply a serendipitous happening, but as the story went on, it became well known that Yuji was intended as a vessel. But what wasn't well known is that he was a cage on purpose. So what really made Yuji into a cage? From what Sukuna has implied, it has to do with the strength of the sorcerer, because he wanted to gain more strength, which means eat more fingers, because he needed more parts of himself to gain over control of Megumi's body. Simple enough. But even with 15 fingers, Megumi can still suppress the flow of cursed energy to Sukuna. He can fight back a little bit. And let's be real here, real quick. Megumi is one of the most powerful sorcerers we know, is the successor of the Zenin clan techniques that once rivaled the 6 Eyes Limitless user. While his powers are very much still in its infancy, remember that Gojo didn't come into his full powers until I believe he was almost 18 or after that. Megumi still has tremendous potential. potential Yuji does not have so far as we know. So it's not just a factor of strength, of cursed technique abilities, or cursed energy output. There's clearly something else there. Something that Yuji was perhaps given by Kenjaku. Have you ever thought about why Kenjaku just didn't wait for Yuji's parents to have a child? It was very clear that they wanted one. That's how Kenjaku duped Jin Itadori into a... well, you know. There are two options here, really. She died or Kenjaku killed her. Well, there's a third boring option of them not being quick enough to make a kid, but we're gonna ignore that. So let's build the most likely scenario. Being a sorcerer who had that intense of a power, I doubt she died from anything mundane. And since, you know, sorcerers don't particularly have strong, meaningful relationships, and if they do, they tend to go poorly. I don't imagine that she was an active sorcerer while married to Jin Itadori. After all, sorcerers generally refuse those ties because it all ends in disaster anyway. By that logic and the fact that children were on the table, Kaori was likely not actively working as a sorcerer, and honestly, she may not have been a jujutsu sorcerer in the traditional sense that we know of, judging by the fact that no mention or recognition of her was ever made by the people who work at Jujutsu High. So there was no acknowledgement of Yuji's mother at all whatsoever. So she could be the one that has the theorized Ainu lineage, and Jin Itadori has the Sukuna lineage. In this scenario that we're building, let's assume that Kenjaku killed her, but that doesn't explain why, you know, he needed to take over her body and then trick Yuji's dad and show himself to the grandfather who clearly knows about sorcerers well enough to at least understand what was going on. It's much easier to let them have the kid, maybe kidnap said kid and murder his parents afterwards, and then take over Kaori once that was done, since he did want her technique. If Kaori was fighting to prevent her kid from being murdered, she would be way more vulnerable. Jin and presumably Kaori Itadori wanted a child. That was evident in Yuji's grandfather's words. Jin and Kaori would have probably made a child regardless. Unless Kenjaku really just had the hots for Jin Itadori and wanted to get bent over by him, I don't see why this was the order of events. Unless Kenjaku really needed to add something to the mix, and by that I mean Kenjaku needed to mother Yuji to form him into a cage. Whether it's a curse, an experiment, or an unknown technique, Kenjaku must have added something to turn what would have been possibly a sorcerer child into a techniqueless yet physically powerful cage. Kenjaku has already had a history of messing with the creation of children with the death wound blood paintings. It's basically confirmed at this point that Yuji is just another one of his experiments. The only question is, what was the experiment? Perhaps Kenjaku utilized something from the original mother of the death wound blood paintings, which would explain why Choso feels like he is Yuji's older brother. It all connects. Yuji being a cage would be too much of an oversight for Kenjaku's well-planned heist, and we know how much care Gege has put into crafting Kenjaku as our villain, and honestly, I'm convinced at this point that Kenjaku is the true main character of JJK, but that's an argument for another day. And this brings us to the next panel that convinces me that this was all deliberate. When Kenjaku reveals that he doesn't care about the death wound blood paintings because they didn't do his intended purpose, we get a vital characterization of him. Kenjaku cares about his plan and his plan alone, and the death wound blood paintings being his creation means absolutely nothing to him if they are not successful creations in aiding him in executing his plan. By this logic, it means that Yuji is exactly successful in what he was meant to do. And the very last piece to our puzzle: what does it really take to be a cage? Yuji does not fit into any category neatly. He's not heavenly restricted, but he's incredibly powerful physically. He has his own cursed energy, but he's not a sorcerer naturally. But he's also not just a normal boy. Kenjaku managed to create something, someone new, successfully. Kenjaku knows exactly what he needed Yuji to be, and Kenjaku knows that was not a vessel. He knows what the capabilities of vessels are, and he knew Megami had that potential. And with that potential, Kenjaku knew that Megami was going to be the final vessel for Sukuna, and that Yuji would be the cage to keep him compliant until he needed him. We come full circle from the worries of Sukuna. Megumi is an objectively more powerful sorcerer than Yuji. We even had Gojo tell us that the last most powerful Zenin clan member had the same powers as him. So then we know it's not just raw power potential. It's not even control of cursed energy. The exact details of it have been left quite vague. What we do know is that Yuji is a nearly perfect cage. And everything, I do mean everything, is going according to Kenjaku's plan. That includes Sukuna's masterful and patient waiting game with Megumi, but we're not out of the woods yet. And in fact, we're just entering the thick of it. Sukuna has been planning this jailbreak since he found out he was placed in a cage. Kenjaku has been planning his imprisonment since the two of them shook on their deal a millennia ago. Kenjaku and Sukuna are both scheming. Because why did Kenjaku have Tsumiki cursed a year before Yuji would even swallow the first finger? I know I'm hitting you with a lot of questions, but why Tsumiki? She was just a nice, normal girl who was taking care of her shit brother and trying to get him to stop beating the shit out of people. And I already caught flack on TikTok and Twitter for this, but I'm doubling down. Megumi is a very singularly focused character. He loves Tsumiki, which makes sense because she is his only family and she was kind and took care of him. Even the manga acknowledges how singularly necessary she is to breaking Megumi. And Kenjaku acquired Tsumiki 1 year ago for the express purpose of giving Yorozu a vessel, while also giving her to Sukuna as a stepping stone to accomplishing his goal of fully breaking Megumi, making good on their deal to provide Sukuna with an actual vessel and not a cage. Kenjaku already had this lined up because he knew he was going to dangle Megumi as an alternate vessel in front of Sukuna. That finger and fearsome womb was a 2-for-1 deal for Kenjaku. He arranged a binding vow for Yuji and placed Megumi as an alternate vessel. It's all too perfect and too convenient without it having been neatly planned by Kenjaku, who I have already demonstrably shown has had his hands in all the pies. If Kenjaku planned for Yuji to be replaced, what happens to him now? Well, aren't you glad you have me? Because we're gonna put on our tinfoil hats because we've got a theory on my hands as to what will happen to Yuji. Yuji's fate is tied to Megumi's. Megumi's peril is the greatest clue we have that Yuji will survive or that he will die with Megumi. Before you all get incredibly depressed, wait 1 second. I have a way that they may be able to survive. This is where we really reach elbow deep into the theory hole of Jujutsu Kaisen.
What did he say?
So y'all better be lubed up and ready to go because we're digging deep and diving deep for this one. If you haven't already heard of the Kodoku legend, I'll summarize it here very quickly. This is a 2chan, the Japanese equivalent of 4chan story. The original thread was from 2005 and it's an inspiration to Gege when he was writing Jujutsu Kaisen. To set the scene, in 2005, I Write Sins Not Tragedies by Panic at the Disco had just come out, and I am still just as emo as I am now. Avatar: The Last Airbender begins airing in February, iShield 21 begins airing in April, Crunchyroll is 1 year away from existing. Are you feeling sufficiently 2005 yet? You better be, because it's not at all relevant. The 2chan story stars a person working at a construction site whose coworkers find a sealed box. Sound vaguely familiar? Now, if you ever find anything sealed, I would hope you do not open it. But they did. And from the priest and his son that comes to their rescue, kinda, we learn this story. Mononobe Tengoku, eerily similar to another name, who is the leader of a secret heretical religious sect, could it be more obvious, and rumored to have come from outside Japan, purchased from the freak show conjoined twins and locked them away for some time in a secret underground chamber with others he'd found with deformities to use in a Kodoku ritual. To survive, those locked in the room were forced to do awful things. Aside from having to kill, they had to turn to cannibalism and consume their own waste. The room was only opened after one remained living. But since Tengoku liked the twins so much, he injured all the other players so that the two of them could survive. And they did. But let me hit pause on this story to explain the concept of Kodoku. It's a curse. Oh god, I'm so surprised. Do it with me. We're so surprised. It's a poison curse made from putting a bunch of poisonous insects together to fight it out until one has come out on top. And the remaining fluids are then used to poison someone with that curse. All right, back to the story. Kenjaku then starved the twins to death after they survived and then turned them into a sokushinbutsu, a mummy that is made from starving alive. This is the inspiration for Ryoma and Sukuna, and probably why we have the mummified fingers. Tengoku then moved the sokushinbutsu around wherever he went, and the legend goes that as Tengoku moved the mummy around with him, natural disasters followed it, which we can kind of see in the way that the fingers awakened and began causing havoc near the end of season 1 of the anime. If you want to read the full story, I'll put the Reddit link down in the description. From what I've observed of Gege's writing, he likes to take bits and pieces of this lore and apply it to concept. While we won't see Gege applying this whole story, we do know that these conjoined twins are really the inspiration for Sukuna. We've seen Daddy Goji Sukuna's form, and he has 2 arms, which probably hints to the conjoined twins. But let's take it one leap further, because that's what we do around here. And make sure you hang on to your tinfoil hats for this one, because what if this symbolizes Yuji and Megumi? Before you say absolutely not, hear me out. The 2 of them have been intertwined within the story constantly. From the beginning, it was Megumi who wanted to save Yuji. Yuji consumed the first finger to save Megumi. And when Yuji needed saving, Megumi stayed behind, staring down the prospect of death. And when Yuji thought he was about to die, he told Megumi to live a long life. The 2 of them have been a unit from when they started. When Tsumiki needed rescuing, he asked Yuji to lend him his strength. They went into the culling games together. The 2 of them want to save each other. That's how it's always been for the 2 of them, and what makes me believe that they could be analogous to the twins that appear in the story. The 2 vessels of Sukuna. One cannot live while the other dies. So in short, if Megumi lives, Yuji lives. If Megumi dies, then Yuji dies. But you might be saying esper. He literally doesn't have Sukuna in him anymore. Well, I've got 2 panels for you. There's this line that's probably been long forgotten from Gojo, but he said that Yuji would gain some of Sukuna's powers. And there are still 5 fingers around and 1 available vessel. Remember that. Anyway, I cannot imagine that Kenjaku does not have a contingency plan as one of the stronger opponents in the world, where he is creating essentially a battle dome. Sukuna at one point or another will want to fight him. If you remember correctly, the binding vows he took with all of the ancient sorcerers became null. While that may mean that his responsibilities are null and void, so are any of his protections that were made with a binding vow, if any. So it's only logical to assume that he has a contingency plan. One of his greatest creations probably plays a part in that. But I don't think we'll see that until the merger with Tengen happens. If you're interested as to the full extent of Kenjaku's plan and what will happen to everyone when Tengen merges with humanity, click on this video. Sorry, over here. This video to get my full theory on that. I'll see you in that video. Bye. It was so stressful.